Hello, I'm your host Peter Sawchuk, a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. You're listening to Work, Learning, and Social Change, Foundational Voices, an informal discussion with some of the figures who have helped to define the field. In this episode, I'm speaking to Miriam Zukas, recently retired professor of adult education and former executive dean of the School of Social Sciences, History, and Philosophy at Birkbeck College, University of London. A long-time work and learning researcher, she is also one of the co-founders of the RWL conference, Researching Work and Learning, the longest continuously running international research conference in its field. Welcome and hello. Our discussion series is meant to be informal, but let me begin with a few prepared remarks by way of introduction to our guest today. Miriam Zukas has remained fascinated over a career by studies of lifelong learning and work in a large variety of forms and contexts. As a feminist scholar, she's been a researcher and leader in the field of adult education, publishing on a range of work-related themes as well, including lifelong learning, pedagogy and policy, vocational and professional education, mentoring, and then a little bit more recently, work and learning, as well as identity formation in academia and in academic work. Excuse me. For the first, working first at the University of Leicester, then at the University of Leeds, where she became full professor, was also named as one of UK's top university educators, and served in several administrative leadership roles, including director of the Lifelong Learning Institute at Leeds. She would eventually arrive at the prestigious Birkbeck College, University of London, where for 7 years, I believe, she served as executive dean of the School of Social Sciences, History, and Philosophy, and would eventually be admitted, I understand, as a fellow of Birkbeck College. She can correct me if I'm wrong on that, my research on that. She likely doesn't remember this, but I first met her at a conference at none other than Birkbeck College, somewhere in the mid-1990s. I can't really remember when. I don't know if she would remember that. We could discuss her scholarly and leadership career, and in part we will. But Miriam has agreed to join me today to discuss the context and the birth of studies of workplace learning in a way, and specifically the birth of the Researching Work and Learning International Conference Series at the University of Leeds in 1999. This is a conference series that would eventually go on, much to the credit of the researchers and leaders at Leeds, to become the longest continuously running international series on this field of study, workplace learning. Anyways, Miriam, welcome to the discussion series. It's absolutely great to see you. Thanks for taking time out of your day and to contribute to our discussion series on these types of themes. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Peter. And thank you for that introduction, which was, you've done your homework.
I try to, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a fun task. Because sometimes I know people and I learn something new about them. Sometimes I don't know them at all and learn some new stuff too. Let me jump right into my first question here. I want to start broadly with your kind of remembrance. We want to use your memory as a resource for us here. Can you walk us through a little bit of your recollections of the kind of context, the broader landscape, maybe even the 1980s into the 1990s, for the people who are interested in studying something called work and learning? To what degree was it a recognized field of study, do you recall? What's your impression? What disciplines might have been involved? What are your impressions on that? Yeah, a broader context. Take us back. Let's use your memory as a resource if we can.
Right, Peter. So I should start by saying I think what I remember comes very much from my own situation as an adult educator. So I spent my whole academic career working with adults, and I was in I joined the department of what was then called Adult Education and Extramural Studies in Leeds. And we didn't have anything called workplace learning. We had divisions which were very much focused on who the students were. So we had a division which focused on trade union studies, and trade union studies was incredibly important. Leeds' situation was in the north of England, and it was near the mines, and so some of the students we taught were miners. That was a strong tradition in trade union studies, and they were people who were working as organisers for the trade unions. They were not the only trade unions that we worked with. We worked with a number, but that was a very strong kind of and important, I think, when thinking about workplace learning, a very important tradition. The second division that we had in the department was what was called continuing professional education, and that was focused on people who had qualified in whatever profession they were in, and it was thinking about, their continuing education. And then we had a whole bunch of other things, in which work was really not significant. I mean, we called it liberal studies, which implied that it had very little to do with vocational or work, or vocational work. And I think there was almost a kind of animosity or tension between some of those areas as I saw it. In addition to that, there were, of course, people working in human resource development, in the business school, in those kinds of areas. And then there were sociologists at work and so on. So there was no field. It was a kind of disparate well, I wouldn't say community. It wasn't anything. It was just a bunch of people doing different kinds of things. Anyway, in the UK, I think what started to inform workplace learning was, on the one hand, a move with the universities that happened in 1992, which was to do with the fact that polytechnics became universities. So the university sector changed quite considerably. Polytechnics were places where people were trained, were educated for professions, for work. Universities tended to be places in which, apart from professions like law and medicine, tended to see themselves as somehow kind of separated from that. Perhaps involved in things to do with work, to do with working with businesses, and to do with industry, developing kind of, I'm sorry about the ums and ahs, to do with developing kind of new technologies and all those kinds of things. But in terms of students, I don't think there was an understanding of universities as places which were focused on developing work skills. When the polytechnics and universities became one big sector and were funded by the same body, I think that had quite a big impact on how the sector began to be seen and to think of itself. I mean, I think at the same time, in the UK context, there was also, we had a Conservative government, and there was kind of view that universities needed to be brought into some kind of line, but nobody was quite sure about what that line was. So something called the Deering Inquiry was set up, which was a 2-year, this is the mid-90s, I'm talking about, 2-year-long inquiry into the purposes of higher education. Very, very important investigation. And it was a very serious investigation into what universities should be doing. So that reported in the end of 96, beginning of 97, and the UK changed its government to a Labour government was voted in 1997. And the then Minister for Education, a guy called David Blunkett, published again a very, very important report called The Learning Age, and it was about, I think it was The Learning Age. But anyway, it was about saying that we needed to think about work, and we needed to think about educating people for work, and we needed to think seriously about basic skills, seriously about the relationship between higher education and work, and so on and so forth. So all of that was kind of chuntering away. And I think it meant that universities, which had been quite disengaged with the idea of work and learning, were kind of given a kick by the government about a particular direction. I mean, in the case of the the polytechnics and universities coming together in one sector. Some polytechnics had already been thinking about this for a very long time, and Middlesex is the one that comes to mind, as really thinking about how do you integrate work and learning in a more satisfactory way. Polytechnics had a very long tradition of people working and studying at the same time. Universities didn't have those the then universities didn't have those kinds of traditions. So I think that started to raise all kinds of questions about what's the relationship between work and learning. And a department there wasn't a department where you would go and people would be asking those kinds of questions. So they tended to be being asked in the old university sectors, as they called it at the time. They tended to be asked by departments like ours, rather than anywhere else in the university. And we had a vice-chancellor who was really keen on what he called third arm activities for universities. Third arm activities was teaching, research, and then this other thing, which was how does the university relate to the rest of the world, to business, to employers, to industry in the broader sense. And he was keen to see that develop. So in our university, I would say 93, 94, the university was keen in exploring what workplace learning might look like. And at that time, there was, for old universities, there weren't very many models to draw on. I mean, there was, in a place like our university, there was this continued professional education kind of model where you shot people in to the institution, and then they did a bit of they did a little course and then they left or whatever. Or there was the kind of sustained model of education where you brought people in, like trade union studies, or in the case of our university, you went out and you tried to work with people in the community. But as a practice, workplace learning wasn't well developed, except, as I say, through the polytechnics. As a research area, I mean, of course, people have been talking about work and learning for a long time, but it wasn't a kind of recognised thing or field. And to me, the people who really began to make it a much more definable field were the people at UTS, at the University of Technology, Sydney, as they set up the various. I mean, the various guises went into. My memory was that they had various units that were the same thing, but were really bringing together the theme of work and learning. And they, yeah.
Oh no! Finish your thought. Sorry.
And that, to me, was the beginning of what I would say an identifiable field, certainly as far as I was concerned, of people kind of skirting around these issues from different angles. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, no, it's fascinating. And then from different vantage points, I just remember the 1990s as well. There were so many gatherings of kind of invited expert panel-y type gatherings in the UK, in Canada, to some degree in Australia. I didn't travel there, but I was in the UK a lot for these things. I know we didn't have a lot of people who called themselves experts, so I was pretty younger, and so you kind of there weren't a lot to choose from, probably from outside, if you want to have any international context.
Yeah, and
so I got to sit on some of these things, but I just, to dial it back a bit to your earlier point, is it just drives home the institutional, I guess, the governance and higher educational institutional basis of the birth of discourses and communities of scholarly communities. That it's not just what can we think of, a bunch of smart people who invent something. It's got to be a confluence of, like, we almost gave this beautiful interinstitutional and historical analysis, all the way from industrial relations in the miners in the mid 80s.
Yeah.
Anyways, and then there was, I tend to agree. I don't know how one would research this, but there was a catalyzing series of things that went on out of those. There was a series of publications out of Sydney, of
Yeah.
UTS. And
Yeah.
they kind of
Really important.
ratified the discourse so that then people
Yeah.
like a campfire could gather around it a little bit more. And that
Yeah.
was happening all at the same time as people were thinking about, well, maybe what would a conference look like and things like that. But anyways, yeah.
Yeah. So that was my, I mean, that was my memory of the kind of the starting point for some of this stuff. And I think that you were right when you said we met in the 90s. I think we met in 98. And we met at there was a joint conference which also has a history, and I can go into it if you like. I think it is pertinent to the birth of RWL, but you can cut this if it's no good. But so shall I talk a little bit about it?
Sure. Are you going to talk about Scutria?
Yeah. So it is pertinent. So in the 80s, the somebody called Phyllis Cunningham and somebody else called Gerald Normie managed to secure some funding from the Kellogg Foundation for an exchange for young academics. I, at that time, I was involved because I was the secretary for Scutria. The chair was held by a guy called Stuart Marriott, who's in my department, which is why I ended up being the secretary. Anyway, the first leg of the exchange was to a AAACE conference in Kentucky. And I think 9 of us came over. And there was a return visit to the UK to a Scutria conference in the following year. I think the original visit was 1984 and the return visit was 1985, something like that. Anyway, the upshot was that there were a group of people who knew each other, who were sort of bound by some kind of feeling of obligation to continue this. And there were a couple more exchanges with various people involved. And out of that came the idea that we should hold a conference that brought together people from AERC, CASI, what was then not really Esria, but was going to become Esria, and Scutria.
But you should say what these things are because some people won't know. Yeah.
So Scutria stood for the Standing Conference of University Teaching and Research in the Education of Adults, which was a kind of loose organisation in the UK that had been in existence. I think by now it was in its second decade, and it was for people researching the education of adults. The CASI, the Canadian Association for the Study of Adult Education, similarly, AERC, the Adult Education Research Conference, which was US and Canada based. I think it had 2 meetings. It had a meeting a year, and the first, in a cycle of 3, 2 were in
3 or 4, they would do
and then 1 in Canada. So it was kind of overlapped. And then in Europe, there wasn't yet formation of a group of interest, but there were a bunch of people who were interested in making a formation, and eventually that became ESRIA, or the European Society for Research in the Education of Adults. Anyway, those groups of people, we decided to hold a conference, and we decided to do it at Leeds because we had this continuing professional education unit which could support a conference, because hosting a conference like that was going to be complicated. It was going to be quite difficult, working across very different traditions, and working with people. I mean, this is before email. Look, the university got a fax machine in order to support the conference. I mean, that is
major commitment.
My first fax from I had to go and collect the faxes from the registry, because there was only one fax machine in the university. So that gives you an idea of how early this was in a way. Anyway, the upshot is that we used the AERC kind of tradition or format where people had to submit proposals with papers. We had a screening committee, and then we chose the papers and we published the papers so that people had them for the conference. You'll recognize all of this now, I think. This is what informs RWL. We use the AERC tradition to develop the content of the conference, to make the conference, and to ensure the kind of quality and all the rest of it. And the conference papers were published, and that was the first, what we then called transatlantic dialogue, because it was fundamentally because of the Kellogg Foundation, but the Europeans joined in. So the conference that I met you at in 1998 was the second conference. I think 97 or 98. I don't have my records, but
it was Skutria, though, I think.
But it was Skutria with the other organizations. It was another conference, and that's what you came to. And it was Paul Armstrong hosted it, and it was held at Royal Holloway out of London. Yeah, and that's where I met you.
Oh, Royal Holloway, man.
Yeah,
beautiful ground.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the kind of follow up to this original conference, and then there was a third follow up, which was in 2000, which was at British Columbia, which was another of those kind of big international conferences, AERC plus some of the other organizations. Anyway, the reason I'm going into all of that is that I think that was very, very important, because a whole bunch of people came together through those conferences who began to talk to each other about things that were, I suppose, began to find some common ground around themes to do with adult education primarily, but researching work and learning became, started to be quite an important theme. And I think that was partly because of the input of people like you, Peter, and all the people in Australia, because they were very, very good at getting to those conferences. A whole bunch of them would turn up, and they really gave a sense of a body of people working collectively on something. Anyway,
absolutely. I remember because I've been involved with the RW over so long. I remember having all these files on every kind of a post-conference report about who actually showed up and and the large clusters that change over the years, but it's still very strongly attended by that Australian. It's not that exact same people, obviously, but always a very strong contributor, and then slowly emerged. I think that's connection with Esria, and then also connected, but also in its own world, that connection with northern, like the Nordic countries in a way, all of a sudden, because they became really strong participants. Anyways, not to get too far away from your point, and I do actually want to ask you about the kind of, if you will, the discussions to beyond the fax machine, the technology that launched you into the future, basically. The personalities involved and what the vision of the outcome, just a little more detail on that. But before I do, I just wanted to say, so the discipline, it's okay to say it this way, I think, the disciplinary bases, given the kind of network of organizations, of organizer types, academic / organizer types who are involved in networks and ran conferences and because not every academic does that. There's certain type that do that and do it well. But these types were primarily out of these adult education things. So it's interesting to see that in the context of how things have evolved in terms of much more variation in terms of disciplinary contributions in the field, in the major journals that often published, and then also at the conference itself. If you could just chart in some bubble graph form the kind of emergence and decline of different kind of disciplinary backgrounds. Anyways, let me, I guess that's more of a comment than a question, but it should, you already kind of answered it, that this adult education thing wasn't an accident in the sense that this disciplinary accent to everything that has kind of emerged in that research conference series. It's adult education.
And then, I mean, I think that you know, anecdotally, you know, when I say that UTS was really important, I mean, they were really important practically in the emergence of RWL. So, shall I move on to that?
Yeah, sure. RWL and the Leeds experience in 1998, 1997, 1999. Yeah.
So again, to contextualize it, my department was always in trouble because we were, you know, as a school of continuing education, we were sort of on the edge, always saying we do special things and we do this, we do that, and we had to box quite clever for a lot of time, and you know, we were always reinventing ourselves. And I think I was trying to explain that the vice chancellor of our university was keen on the development of this third arm, and he was, I mean, he wasn't kind of an instrumentalist. He was keen on it for quite visionary purposes about what the university could contribute. You know, how could the university benefit work and industry and business, and how could business and work and industry benefit the university? So, you know, I think he was quite keen to make it more make it more porous, really, and that was very difficult. It was a very, very difficult thing to try and do, of course. And at some point, a couple of people were appointed to develop workplace learning, and I got brought into that. I think they were situated in the education department, and our department was quite cross about it because we regarded ourselves as the people who did workplace learning. Anyway, they set up a scheme based on the Middlesex model, and that would have been in sort of 94, 95, where we were supposed to work with companies, with workers who didn't have qualifications, academic qualifications, and help those workers to develop academic qualifications that they themselves stipulated what the curriculum would be and how they would develop their qualifications. And I was brought in as one of the tutors. I mean, it was a completely crazy scheme. I found a kind of something that I'd written, which was saying how crazy I thought it was, and you know, because it was impossible. These were workers who were working on assembly lines making soap, you know, and they were expected to work with their tutors to develop a curriculum. I mean, it was kind of mad. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that I think that project imploded, and the vice chancellor asked our school to take up workplace learning, to make it part of our, you know, one of our threads of activity. And so this is why I'm telling you, because some of the personalities came in, then got sort of started working on it. So one of them was Keith Forrester, because he was coming from the kind of industrial studies trade union arena. Another was Kevin Ward, who was coming from community adult education perspective. Another was Dick Taylor, who was then head of department and had a kind of broad remit. And another was Nick Frost, who was coming from sort of social work arena. And the department didn't really, I mean, I'm sure my colleagues would tell me that they knew what they were doing, but I don't think they really knew what they were doing. But we were kind of muscling in on this activity. So that's, and we set up a unit, which wasn't, in my view, a wholly satisfactory unit ever. But nevertheless, we were trying to claim some ground within the university on workplace learning. And it wasn't that we didn't have experience, and there wasn't, there was, of course, through what had been the workplace, through the trade union studies, industrial studies, we'd had projects that were about learning in the workplace. It wasn't kind of completely undeserved, but it was nevertheless, I think, trying to think about workplace learning in quite bringing some of the values of trade union studies and the equity and all the rest of it to this idea of workplace learning. Okay, so that's kind of was going on, and then what was also happening, I think, on a sort of personal level, was that I took over as head of department in 1997, in the middle of all of this. And various other things were happening in the department, and there were changes of government and changes of funding and all of that stuff. And I felt, as head of department, that we needed to do something that kind of made us more coherent as a department, because we were so many bits and pieces. I don't think it was coincidence, but I had connections with Dave Bowd because of Scutria and all of those other things. And Dave, I wrote to Dave asking if he'd like to apply for a Leverhulme Fellowship to come and work with us at the university, to have research leave at the university. Anyway, I don't know that he applied for it, but the upshot was that he came to the university beginning of 1998 to Leeds. And he and I, and this is the honest truth, he and I were talking about the leadership of the department, and I talked to him about what was happening at UTS, and he told me the story of how they had basically all said, we need to work on a collective project, and that project was going to be, God, what was the unit called that they set up?
I don't know, but anyway, I remember when it changed.
Yeah. Anyway, they got funding to set up the unit, and everybody said that they would put their shoulders to the same project. And, people like Paul Hager and Dave and many, many other people, Clive Chappell and Nikki Solomon and lots of other people who were coming from very different walks of life, got involved in the project. And I thought, we need to do something like that. And I said to Dick and probably Kevin, I think we need to claim the space here. And a way to do that is to run a conference. So that was 98. And at the same time, we were trying to say to the university, we've got kind of common cause here. And we set up the Lifelong Learning Institute, which was to bring together all our research.
Okay.
And so we got permission to appoint a professor of lifelong learning, who we appointed September 99. Phil Hodkinson joined us. But by 1999, September 99 was the first conference. So all of these things were happening. So the conference was really saying, we're claiming a space called work and learning, and we're going to try and use this kind of internationally, intellectually, but also politically in terms of our position within the university, and to tie it up with the establishment of this thing called the Lifelong Learning Institute. So that is my memory. And the reason I thought of the conference was because of my involvement leading the earlier conference in 1988, where I knew, so it didn't feel impossible to me. It felt that it was something that we could do. We'd got experience in the department of running an international conference. We knew that we could do it at scale. And we had the infrastructure in the department, in the school, and the experience of how to do that. So that's why it took the particular form that it did, why we had published proceedings, why it was organised in the particular way that it was organised. So that's the kind of and then once we'd agreed that we were going to do that, the organizing panel, I mean, I was busy being head of department, so it became Dick and Nick and Keith and Kevin were the kind of organizing committee with support from somebody else who was in continuing professional education bit of the department. So that's the background to the conference. And Keith was well connected with the people in the business school. So my memory, although this could be wrong, was that there were a bunch of people, and I never know the terms, you'll know the right terms. There was a kind of division in the business school between those people who were, if I can put it, left of centre, and thinking about human resource in a kind of emancipatory, developmental way, and then those people who were thinking about human resources, a kind of,
technicist and human capital.
Capital, yeah, exactly. But there was a difference in the terms that people used, and one was HRD, and the other was
HRM. HRM.
Exactly. So there was an HRM group of people, and there was an HRD group of people.
Yeah.
And Keith was well in with the HRD people, and they provided a bridge, an academic bridge, into a community that I think we wouldn't have been well connected with. And then, I think the guys and girls in the sort of in the sort of burgeoning workplace learning area were involved, and we had good connections with what then became ESRIA. So that's where the Europeans got brought in, and of course the other personality who's important in this is Bruce Spencer. So do you know who Bruce Spencer is?
Yeah, he's
okay. Yeah. So Bruce had been at Leeds.
Yes.
Bruce was in the department, and then he moved to Canada. But he was a very strong link between Leeds and Canada, and through him, people like you and David and various other Canadians in this kind of arena were kind of brought into the community. And then through Dave Bowd and various other connections with UTS, they were brought in, and the kind of Middlesex people were brought in through the kind of workplace learning sort of community, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think some of the critical economists were brought in through my colleague Jean Gardner. Nick Frost had his community of kind of not just social work, but professions more generally. So it was, people were drawing on their own disciplinary fields to kind of make the conference. Does this make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. It explains a lot. I mean, I'm particularly fascinated by all this, but it explains a heck of a lot in terms of the kind of people who served as linkages to networks, and those specific linkages then in a way, because they shape the identity in its initial evolution in ways that basically a ship takes off from a shoreline, and it's kind of pointed in a direction, and it can change, but it's took off in a direction. Yeah.
So that's my memory of
that's wonderful.
And I tell you one thing that I feel really bad about. I didn't go to the conference.
You never were at the conference? I kind of don't remember. I remember the conference.
I have no. I was trying to work out why I wasn't there. There was a good reason.
Well, you're probably running the institute.
I think it's to do with the fact that I could not get away on holiday, except for the 2 weeks around that period, for various reasons to do with other commitments. And I think I was on holiday during the conference, and I've always felt bad about that. But I knew it was going to be fine, and it was. But that's the worst of all of this.
That's funny. Well, you then stayed with the conference in the advisory capacity for 20 years something. Yeah, so that was pretty amazing of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, to do that. I actually have some old pictures from that conference. Because people kind of would congregate after in the restaurant pubby area, and I have some. I don't know what this sharing status of those, pulling out an old Polaroid and posting on the web. I'm sure they're not allowed to do that. So, but nonetheless, I have this kind of packet in an old-fashioned camera packet
Oh, wow.
envelope. Yeah, of most of the people who stayed with it, were those people who, it's over a course of like 3 nights,
Yeah.
but it's the same basic shots, but there's just
Yeah.
different people in them. It's a very strange little series. Anyways, this, you've added a layer of, in essence, analysis, an institutional analysis. I think we really benefit from the fact that you've been in the machinery and leading the machinery of university administration, because I think that's a kind of insight that I just, beyond your original experiences through the 90s, and with the Leeds, launching the Leeds conference specifically, and RWO1, I think your perspective is, I find absolutely fascinating. This confluence of issues of governance that emerge in government and changing with changing government, the way universities and this kind of community outreach or third arm perspective, it's taken on many terminologies over the course of decades. But those type of things all contribute to, and the existence of these academic networks that gave it its character. To summarize lightly what you've kind of walked us through, or an oral history of the birth of kind of a field. Well, not that it didn't exist, but it didn't exist in a recognizable, self-aware way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. But I think that's right. I think that you made the point earlier that you can't just bring a group of people together and say, right, we're going to create a new field now. In a way, you have to have also, you have to have something to work with. You have to have the networks, to use a phrase, and the traces of something to kind of knit it together. It could not have been, it would not have happened. And some things are incidental, not incidental, they're very important, but they're not, you couldn't have predicted that it would go in that way. But I mean, that, the life of that AARC Scutria Kasai conference kind of feeding through this. I mean, I see it, and I see that the possibility of doing something like this is, especially for such a disparate field, is something that you have to have something to base it on. You can't just kind of pluck an idea out of the air and say we're gonna do this. But then you have to have huge commitment and continuing friendships, connections, passion, really, for this thing, because without it, it relies on all of that to hold it together. I mean, that is the network. Yeah. But it had to have institutional base. I mean, that's the thing that I think, when we move on, that's the problem with what's happened since then. Without some institutional infrastructure, it's impossible. And I'm sure we'll come on to that.
Yeah, at multiple levels. I mean, it's kind of like stuff, I want to say opportunity structure, but also resource availability, mobilization. It's all its forms, and they both have to meet the opportunity. Yeah, and government policy, is a kind of hidden actor in a lot of this, in terms of not just money, and probably not primarily money. It's about a kind of legitimation of a type of focus for higher education and researchers, and then those researchers then try to make it their own. Like you've said in a number of different ways how we wanted to create an identity, and we chose this as one of the contributing methods, the conference series, to kind of do that. And and I want to ask you, there's two more questions I want to ask you, but I'm getting very self-conscious about the time here. I think it's You mentioned Phyllis Cunningham and the Northern Illinois University had a very strong work-based learning program. Um, and Penn State University, a lot of graduates from Northern Illinois, very, very strong adult ed tradition as well. Well, primarily, and then kind of a pod of
Yeah,
it. Yeah. And I'm very surprised that there's only been a few fellow travelers that
yeah,
have stayed from that American context.
yeah.
It speaks to this idea of the networking of networks that can degrade and is a contributing factor to the identity that things happen that organizations like the RWL take on and how they evolve. Yeah, for sure. Well, here's a question then. Your impression, since you've been involved, and you don't have to do it as a length in such a lengthy fashion, but your impression of the evolution of RWL to more contemporary times, because you've had feet and you've attended, you've been involved in all the discussions about what the next conference looks like over the course of several decades. And it's different than what it was in 1999 or 2001, for instance, because I think of 2001 as kind of like the more almost the twin of 1999, RW1 and W2. And in part, Bruce Spencer was involved a little bit in that too. So there's a reason for that. But RWL 11 and 12, they look very different. And do you have any kind of a sense of overall some points of how it's evolved and how it's a little different, for better and worse and everything in between?
Well, I think that RWL takes on the character wherever it is, of wherever it is, and what the kind of pressures are in those places. I think back to the 2007, which was in South Africa, and it had a very distinct flavour, and the discussions and kind of focus of that conference is very different to ones that had happened in Europe or Australia or whatever. So I think one of the things about RWL is that, at least in my experience, local contingents, the local concerns and contingencies shape that conference quite a lot, because those are the people who are contributing the majority of papers because they travel. Although I don't know about the last one, because of course a lot of it was not done face to face. But I think that has meant that it's a kind of chameleon conference. That people use, well, again, I can't say, but on the whole, many people have used it to hone the particular agendas that are going on in their country at a particular moment. And if I think about the ones in Europe that I've been to, they felt very very concerned about European funding and European kind of traditions and so on and so forth, even though there were lots of people from other places. So I'd say the conference has changed quite a lot. That would be the first thing. The second, I'd say, is that I think that it's kind of atomized a little bit, in the sense that other groups have emerged, and other when this was invented, something called professional learning or was kind of not on the scene. So something like, if I think about something that I've been involved in, which is medical education and the education of doctors, I mean, we were really keen to bring together ideas that have come out of the kind of researching, work and learning arena and the clinical education arena, and to kind of fuse those ideas in a creative way. But of course, what then happens is that, well, in the case of medical education, they swallow the ideas up and they kind of eat them in their own conferences. They digest them in their own conferences. So I think that all with some of the other kind of professional learning stuff. And I mean, I was party to that as well, when Sterling, through Tara and Richard, set up the Professional Lifelong Learning series.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't, you know, many of the same characters were part of that, of PLL, as were RWL. But it had a particular kind of slant, and it brought in slightly different people, like people from Norway or whatever. So I think that there has been a kind of spawning. It was is a positive word of other interest groups, but I think that there has been a huge reduction in these spaces within universities where this kind of thing can exist. And, I'm not just talking about schools of continuing education, but I'm talking about the kind of nooks and crannies that you need for this kind of operation. And I think there's a sort of almost a mainstreaming of, from where I stand, sort of with the sort of rigors of people having to prove, I don't know how widely read their work is, however universities judge that, or how fantastic a journal is, that it's the top #1 that you got published in, or whatever, that actually that's detracted people from speaking together in these kind of weird spaces. Because I think research and work and learning is a weird space where you will talk to people who are doing stuff that doesn't, on the surface of it, look like you. And I'd say that perhaps what's happened is that it's become a more marginal space that is not well supported institutionally, for people to try out ideas and to be creative about what they're doing and what they're thinking. I mean, that's just my impression. I don't know if that has in any way justified, but I think that's been happening over time.
It's very familiar to me. I think you'd almost have to have somebody from several different kind of global regions or countries kind of respond to their impressions of your impression. But my impressions, of course, kind of there's some similarities with the Commonwealth countries, but it's a lot of that rings true. There's a kind of kind of more this spawning thing in my perspective as well, that there are other places you can go and get together with people who do something like what you do, as opposed to the 1990s, where workplace learning was people were a little bit more fragmented, isolated in their own little disciplinary context. I definitely think that the accountability agenda for academic production, is, to your point, it would definitely influence people when they make their decisions about how to spend their time, and where to publish and things of that nature, how to kind of identify themselves and present themselves. Anyways, and so much more is true. No, I think it's really helpful to think in those terms, because to anticipate a little bit the future by understanding the past, we might have a little bit more purchase with how we negotiate that. So I think that's really well put. I don't want to let you go, though, for one final question, which I ask everybody that I speak with on this, which is your advice now to young scholars, emerging scholars, or people just coming into maybe academia. I think you are uniquely positioned because you've occupied so many positions as a researcher, rank and file academic, if you will, as well as in various separate administrative and in some cases high level administrative roles, where you get different, fundamentally different perspectives and experiences. So it could be a whole video. I would say I would listen to that video just on this question with you. But if you would, kind of encapsulate it a little bit to say, if there was, 2 or 3 things you might say, words of advice to younger researchers, people maybe
just gave me a piece of advice, which I have to say has stood me in amazing stead. And he said, you know, um, especially at the beginning of your career, don't pass up chances to do things that don't necessarily fit with your plan. That do things that don't necessarily fit with your plan if you get an opportunity. And I think behind that, the analogy I'd use is a library. It's one thing looking for a book on the web that you know you're going to find, blah, blah, blah. If you go to the library and there's a bookshelf, you might well find something that is actually really interesting and that you weren't expecting to find. And I think I'd say to young researchers that they're so encouraged to be very, very focused and, production centered. And I'd say, go to the library sometimes. I mean, just take the odd chance of going to a conference or going to something that you don't necessarily know what you're going to get out of. That redundancy is really, really, really potentially very productive. And I had no idea when I went to my first conference, which I didn't know what the hell I was doing at, what would come out of it, which was my career, basically. So that would be my first thing.
Mm.
And my second, I guess, relevant to this, would be that, I would go to things that I'm not very interested in, and not be too overly focused on what's relevant and what's not relevant. But I would also give myself to talk to people in the bar or to hang out a little bit, again, without being too focused on what you can get out of it, because you don't know. And I think the opportunity to hang out and to I don't want to call it wasting time, because I don't think it's like that, but just to exist with other people in a sociable space is so fantastic and gives you perspective on what you're doing and will give you so much more than you think. So I guess this sounds awful, but I'm saying don't be too focused on your plan, on your academic plan, and give yourself some space to breathe when it comes to thinking about conferences or whatever, because you will get much, much more than you're expecting from those things that you don't plan.
Mm. Mm.
That's
That's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I find myself sometimes swimming against that excellent advice by, pushing students to maintain a focus. And
me too.
and so, but I completely agree with what you said, and it's really well put. Like, there's so few and far between the sources of kind of inspiration and creativity that you kind of shouldn't pass up the opportunity to engage. And then also working with groups of people is the lifeblood of good research these days, in partnership with others and networks. Yeah. Anyways, all very, very good advice. I will try to rescue the last portion of my career using that advice a little bit as best I can, maybe a little more consistently. But it was so nice to talk to you. I want to bring this to a close. I love seeing your face. I miss the times we've had dinners together. And
come to London
someday. Yeah. Well, I definitely got to find an excuse and reason to get there, and I'm gonna look you up. And so glad to hear that your retirement is unfolding, despite the bumpiness of the pandemic years, is unfolding in a good direction, and that you're well, and that you and your partner are both well. Yeah, very good.
It's lovely to see you, and thank you for that chance to revisit my past.
It's really important and really insightful. Not everyone is interested in this stuff, but the people who are very interested, and it's very helpful. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and have a great day.
Okay, thanks, Peter.
Okay, goodbye.